The world changed forever on September 1st, 1939. Nazi Germany had invaded Poland, and in a matter of weeks, Europe was at war once again. The conflict that so many had feared, but desperately hoped to avoid, had begun. Across the continent, nations braced for what was to come, watching in terror as Hitler's armies unleashed their Blitzkrieg, lightning-fast warfare that shattered defenses and crushed entire nations before they even had time to react. And there, right in the very heart of Europe, was Switzerland, a small, landlocked country staring into the abyss. The question gripping its government, its military, and its people was simple, but chilling. Would Switzerland be next? For over a century, neutrality had been Switzerland's shield. It had allowed the Swiss to navigate the horrors of World War I without becoming entangled in the bloodshed. But this time was different. This time, neutrality alone might not be enough. Adolf Hitler despised Switzerland. To him, it was a bastard state, a tiny but irritating obstacle in his grand vision for a racially pure, German-dominated Europe. He saw the German-speaking Swiss not as an independent people, but as rightful subjects of his Reich. With Germany to the north and Mussolini's Fascist Italy to the south, Switzerland was now surrounded by two Axis powers. The shadow of war loomed larger than ever before. Within 3 days of Germany's invasion of Poland, Switzerland took no chances. On September 4th, 1939, the government declared a general mobilization. It was one of the largest military responses of any neutral country in history. In towns and villages across the country, over 430,000 Swiss men left their homes, their jobs, their families, and took up arms. In a nation of just 4 million people, this was an extraordinary display of readiness. Unlike other small European nations that placed their hopes in diplomacy, Switzerland's leaders understood one thing: only strength would keep them safe. The government sent a message that could not be mistaken. If attacked, Switzerland would fight to the last man. But the Swiss knew that traditional military tactics would never work against a force like Germany's. The Nazis had already demonstrated their overwhelming might. In Poland, entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Tanks, bombers, and mechanized infantry crushed resistance in mere weeks. If the Nazis turned their gaze towards Switzerland, a conventional battle in the valleys and plains would be a death sentence. So the Swiss army devised something radical, something that would make an invasion a nightmare for any attacker. It was called the Reduit strategy. The idea was bold but extreme. If Germany attacked, Swiss forces would not attempt to hold their positions in open ground. Instead, they would retreat into the Alps. There, deep within the mountains, they would transform the rugged terrain into a near-impenetrable fortress. Bunkers, tunnels, and underground command centers were carved into rock. Supply depots were hidden in the highlands, and artillery positions were set up to dominate key passes. Should the invasion come, Swiss forces would blow up their own roads, bridges, and railways, cutting off any invading force. The Nazis would find themselves trapped in a landscape they couldn't conquer, facing a well-armed and highly motivated resistance. Occupation, if even possible, would be costly, grueling, and bloody. Switzerland would become a graveyard for invaders. While the military braced for an attack, Switzerland's government waged a different kind of war, a battle of diplomacy, secrecy, and survival. The Swiss had to convince Hitler that invading their country was not worth the cost. At the same time, they had to assure the Allies that they were not collaborating with the Axis. It was a delicate, dangerous balancing act. One wrong move, and Switzerland could find itself facing the full wrath of the Nazi war machine. Behind closed doors, Swiss officials held secret negotiations, trying to determine if the Allies would come to their aid in the event of an invasion. Swiss military intelligence worked tirelessly, monitoring German troop movements and watching for any sign that an attack was imminent. the government sent carefully worded messages to Berlin, emphasizing Switzerland's neutrality, while subtly signaling to the Allies that they would not be willing partners to the Axis war effort. It was a high-stakes game of survival, one that had to be played flawlessly. But Switzerland didn't just prepare militarily. It waged a psychological war for public perception. A massive propaganda campaign was launched. Posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts sent a single, unwavering message. Switzerland was neutral, but not weak. It did not seek war, but it would never surrender. The world needed to know, and so did the Swiss people. The threat was real, and every man, woman, and child had a role to play in ensuring Switzerland's survival. The economy, too, had to be prepared for the coming storm. Switzerland stockpiled fuel, food, and medical supplies, knowing that war could cut them off from trade at any moment. Factories that once produced watches and luxury goods now shifted gears, manufacturing weapons, munitions, and essential war materials. Meanwhile, Swiss banks, already among the most powerful in Europe, quietly maintained financial ties with both Axis and Allied powers. Switzerland's economic neutrality would later become one of the most controversial aspects of its wartime history. But at the time, it was simply another means of survival. As the year 1939 gave way to 1940, Switzerland remained on high alert. Poland had fallen. Hitler had turned his attention westward. Within months, Denmark and Norway would fall. Then, in a matter of weeks, the world would watch in shock as France collapsed under the Nazi war machine. By the summer of 1940, Switzerland would be completely surrounded by Axis-controlled territory. And by then, something even more terrifying was already in motion. Operation Tannenbaum, the Nazi invasion of Switzerland, had begun taking shape. The Swiss military received intelligence reports that chilled them to the bone. Nazi generals were studying maps, analyzing invasion routes, and calculating how long it would take to crush Swiss resistance. The Germans estimated that within a few weeks, Switzerland could be subdued. It was no longer a question of if Hitler would give the order, but when. The Swiss population could feel it. A war that had once seemed distant was now at their doorstep. Soldiers stood at the borders, rifles in hand, waiting for an enemy that could arrive at any moment. Families braced for the worst, knowing that their country might soon become another casualty of the Nazi war machine. And then something changed. The invasion never came. In the next episode, we dive deep into Operation Tannenbaum, the Nazi plan to invade Switzerland, and the shocking reasons why it was never executed.